The gunshot echoed like thunder through the narrow pass. Old Pete staggered backward, blood spreading dark across his chest. Margaret screamed and fired back her bullet, finding its mark in the rider's hand. Pete fell to his knees, eyes unfocused. "Promise me," he gasped, blood at the corner of his mouth. "Promise you'll finish it." Margaret knelt beside him in the dirt, tears streaming. "I promise." Pete's breathing slowed, stopped. His eyes stayed open, staring at stars he couldn't see anymore. Margaret stood alone in the darkness and made a choice. She would ride to Denver. She would expose the truth, or she would die trying. But to understand how a Boston woman ended up in a Wyoming mountain pass fighting for her life and holding documents that could destroy the most powerful man in 3 counties, we need to go back. Back to a train platform. Back to a blizzard. Back to the day Margaret Calloway stepped off that train with $23 and no idea her life was about to change forever. December 17th, 1885. A woman stepped off the train in Milford Creek, Wyoming, with $23, a carpet bag, and a letter from a man she'd never met. By nightfall, half the town wanted her gone. By week's end, they'd realized she was the only thing standing between them and ruin. But first, she had to survive the night. The wind hit Margaret Calloway like a fist the moment her boot touched the platform. Snow swirled in angry gusts, stinging her face, blinding her vision. She pulled her thin coat tighter, knowing it wouldn't help. The coat had been meant for Boston winters, not this. Not Wyoming. Not the kind of cold that felt like it wanted to kill you. The train behind her hissed steam into the white void. Other passengers hurried past, heads down, bodies bent against the weather. They knew where they were going. They had people waiting. Margaret had a letter crumpled from 3 weeks of anxious handling and the fading hope that she hadn't made the worst mistake of her life. She scanned the platform through the snow. Empty, no tall rancher waiting, no wagon, just whiteness and wind, and a small station house with smoke rising from its chimney like a lonely prayer. The conductor appeared at her elbow, a grizzled man whose face looked carved from the same rock as these mountains. He shouted over the wind, "Anyone meeting you, Miss Margaret," pulled out the letter, unfolded it with numb fingers. "Mr. Brennan was supposed to be here." "William Brennan." The conductor shook his head. "Storm's been building for 2 days. Smart folks are staying home." His eyes moved over her, assessing. Not much mercy in the look, just facts. "You got somewhere to wait." Margaret looked at the station house. Through its frost-covered window, she could see a stove glowing red. She nodded. The conductor touched his cap. "Train heads back east tomorrow noon. If you decide Wyoming ain't for you." Then he was gone, swallowed by steam and snow. Margaret stood alone on the platform. Behind her, the train's whistle screamed. Ahead, a town she couldn't see through the blizzard. In her hand, words written by a stranger. "Miss Calloway, storm delayed me. Take shelter at Milder's Hefe. Will arrive tomorrow. W. Brennan, tomorrow." She'd traveled 2,000 miles to meet a man who couldn't be bothered to brave a snowstorm. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Not surprise, not disappointment. Just the familiar weight of being alone, settling back onto her shoulders, where it had lived for 26 years. She picked up her carpet bag. The weight of it reminded her of what she carried. Clothes, yes. A few books. Her mother's locket. But hidden in the false bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, the documents that had made her run from Boston. The survey maps and correspondence that proved her father had been right. That someone was stealing land. That truth still mattered even when the people who needed to hear it didn't want to listen. Margaret limped toward the station house. Her left leg ached in the cold. The old injury from the horse accident flaring like it always did when the weather turned mean. She'd been 15 when she fell. The leg had healed crooked. The doctor said she'd walk with a limp forever. Her stepfather said no man would want damaged goods. He'd been right about that. Until she'd found an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper from a desperate widower in Wyoming who needed a wife and didn't list beauty among his requirements. The station house door opened before she could reach it. An old man stood there, squinting at her through the snow. "You the mail-order bride." The words hit harder than the wind. Margaret had known that's what she was. But hearing it said out loud, casual as commenting on the weather, made it real in a way the long train ride hadn't. She lifted her chin. "I'm Margaret Calloway. I'm here to meet William Brennan." The old man spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Brennan sent word 3 days ago. Said he couldn't come to town. Baby's sick, storm coming, said if you arrive, take shelter here till it passes. Margaret felt her heart kick against her ribs. Baby's sick. The letter hadn't mentioned that, but then again, William Brennan's letters had been sparse on details. Practical, direct. He needed a wife. She needed a home. The arrangement made sense on paper. Whether it would make sense in life remained to be seen. How far is his ranch at 8 miles north? The old man looked at her like she'd asked how far it was to the moon. But you can't go out in this. Storms turning into a killer. Temperatures dropping fast. You go out there, you'll freeze to death inside of an hour. Margaret looked past him at the warm station house. Then she looked north toward a ranch she couldn't see, toward 5 children she'd never met, toward a baby who was sick and a man who was probably desperate enough by now to marry anything with a pulse and basic household skills. Is there a wagon I can rent? A horse? The station master stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Miss, are you deaf? I said, you'll die out there. Then I'll die as Mrs. Brennan, not Miss Calloway, waiting on a platform. The words came out harder than she'd intended, but Margaret was tired of waiting, tired of being careful, tired of letting other people decide what was best for her. Her father had decided she should marry his business partner's son. Her stepmother had decided she should be grateful for the offer. Nathaniel Price had decided she'd come around eventually. They'd all decided wrong. Which direction is north? Margaret asked again. The station master looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his weathered face shifted, not quite respect, but recognition. He'd seen obstinate people before, probably been obstinate himself once upon a time, or he wouldn't be living in Wyoming territory. He went inside and came back with a compass and a lantern. Borrowed, he said. You bring them back when the storm clears. And here, he pressed something into her hand. Hip flask. Whiskey. You get too cold, a sip will help. Just a sip. More than that, you'll make bad decisions. Margaret took the flask, slipped it into her pocket next to her father's documents. Thank you. The station master shook his head. Don't thank me. If you die out there, I'll feel responsible. And I got enough on my conscience already. Margaret shouldered her carpet bag, checked the compass, started walking north. Behind her, she heard the station master mutter, "Damn fool woman, damn brave fool woman." She didn't disagree with either assessment. The first 100 yards weren't so bad. The town proper provided some shelter from the wind. Margaret passed dark buildings, their windows glowing yellow against the white, a general store, a church, something that might have been a saloon. She kept her head down and kept walking. Then the buildings ended and the open land began, and the wind hit her full force. Margaret had thought she understood cold. Boston winters were harsh, but this was different. This wasn't weather. This was malice. The wind didn't blow past you in Wyoming. It went through you, searching for warmth to steal, for will to break, for reasons to lie down and stop fighting. She put one foot in front of the other, checked the compass every few steps. North. Always north. The snow was knee-deep in places, waist-deep where it had drifted. Her skirts grew heavy with ice. Her hands went numb inside her gloves. The lamplight barely penetrated 5 feet ahead. Margaret counted steps to keep her mind occupied. 100, 200. How many steps in 8 miles, she tried to calculate. Lost track. Started over. The numbers became a rhythm. The rhythm became a prayer. Please, just let me make it. Please. She didn't know who she was praying to. Her mother's God, maybe. The stern deity of church and consequence. Or maybe her father's God, the one who believed in second chances and hard work, in the basic fairness of the universe if you were brave enough to demand it. The wind screamed louder. The snow fell thicker. Margaret's leg blazed with pain. She twisted it in a drift a mile back. Or maybe 2 miles. Distance lost meaning. Time lost meaning. There was only the compass pointing north and the certainty that stopping meant dying. Her father's voice came to her through the storm. You're stronger than you think, Maggie. You've always been stronger than you think. Thomas Calloway had called her Maggie. Her mother had insisted on Margaret proper and formal. But her father had seen something in her that needed a shorter, tougher name. He'd been a surveyor for the railroad, a man who measured land and made maps and believed that truth was something you could prove with numbers and documents. When he died 6 months ago, Margaret had found his papers. The evidence of fraud, The proof that someone was stealing land from homesteaders and selling it to the railroad at inflated prices. Her stepmother had wanted her to burn the papers. Too dangerous, she'd said. Too complicated. Let it go. But Margaret couldn't let it go. Her father had died trying to expose the truth. The least she could do was finish his work, even if it meant running from Boston, even if it meant answering an advertisement from a stranger, even if it meant walking through a blizzard toward a future she couldn't predict or control. Margaret stumbled, nearly fell. Her hands hit ice. Her carpet bag slipped from her grasp. She scrambled to retrieve it, shoving belongings back inside with fingers that felt like wooden blocks. The documents. Where were the documents? Panic flared. Then her hand found the oilcloth bundle. Still safe, still hidden. She stood, swayed. The world tilted sideways. For a moment she thought about lying back down. Just for a minute. Just to rest. Her father's voice again. Get up, Maggie. You don't quit. You've never quit. Margaret got up. The compass showed north. She walked. Time disappeared. There was only cold and white and the mechanical process of forcing one leg to move after the other. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, then to a pinprick. She was walking blind now, trusting the compass because she couldn't trust her eyes anymore. Then impossibly, a light. Margaret blinked. Hallucination, probably. People saw things when they froze to death. Warm fires, tropical beaches, heaven opening its golden gates. But the light didn't disappear. It grew stronger. A window. A real window with real light spilling out across real snow. A cabin, log walls, smoke rising from a chimney, the smell of wood fire cutting through the bite of ice and wind. Margaret stumbled forward. 10 yards. 5. Her legs wouldn't obey anymore. She fell against the door, fist raised, and managed 3 weak knocks before consciousness started slipping sideways. She heard voices inside. A man's voice, deep and rough. A child's voice, high and scared. Footsteps approaching. The door opened. Margaret looked up into the face of William Brennan. He was taller than she'd imagined. Broader, dark hair and dark eyes and a beard that needed trimming. Weathered face. Strong hands. But it was his eyes that struck her. They were exhausted. Hollowed out. The eyes of a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. He stared at her. She stared back. Then Margaret said very carefully, very clearly, I'm Margaret Calloway. I'm here to save your daughter. And then the world went black and she fell forward into his arms. William Brennan caught her on instinct. One moment he was standing in his doorway, Baby Rose clutched against his chest, trying to understand why someone was knocking in the middle of a blizzard. The next moment he had an unconscious woman in his arms, snow-covered and half-frozen and weighing almost nothing. Behind him, his 9-year-old son Ethan stared with wide eyes. Pa, who is that? Will didn't answer. He was too busy carrying the woman inside, kicking the door shut behind him, laying her carefully on the floor near the fire. Her face was pale, blue tinged around the lips, but her chest moved. She was breathing. He checked her hands. Frozen. Her feet. Also frozen, the leather boots coated in ice. He started unlacing them with one hand, still holding Rose with the other. The baby whimpered weakly. She'd been whimpering like that for hours. Not crying, not really alive. Just making small sounds that meant she was fading. Pa. Ethan appeared at his elbow, face too serious for 9 years old. Is that the lady from your letters? Will looked at the woman's face. He'd only seen a tintype photograph. Small, grainy, showing a plain-faced woman with light hair and serious eyes. This woman matched the photograph. But the photograph hadn't shown the iron will in the set of her jaw, or the way her hands, even frozen, still clutched the carpet bag like it contained something precious. I think so, Will said. Get me blankets and warm water. Not hot. Warm. Ethan ran. 7-year-old Sarah appeared in the doorway to the back room holding 5-year-old Lily's hand. Behind them, 3-year-old Michael rubbed sleep from his eyes. Is she dead? Sarah asked in a small voice. No, Will said it firmly. She's not dead. She's cold. We're going to warm her up. He wrapped the woman in blankets while Ethan brought water. Will pressed warm cloth to her hands, her face, her feet. Slowly, color began returning. Her eyelids fluttered. Will leaned close. Miss Calloway, can you hear me? Her eyes opened, gray-blue, clear despite the exhaustion. She looked at him for a long moment, focusing. Then her gaze dropped to the baby in his arms. How long has she been sick? Will blinked. That was her first question. Not where am I or what happened or even who are you, but straight to the point. How long has the baby been sick? Since yesterday afternoon. Fever started climbing. I sent for the doctor, but he's across the valley treating the Johnsons. Won't be back until morning. The woman sat up. Will tried to stop her, but she pushed his hands away. Let me see her. You need to rest. You nearly died out there, and that baby will die if someone doesn't help her. Now let me see her. Something in her voice made Will obey. He passed Rose over, reluctant watching as this stranger unwrapped the blankets and examined his daughter with quick, efficient movements. She felt Rose's forehead, her neck, her chest, checked her breathing, looked inside her mouth, smelled her breath. It's not childbed fever, the woman said after a moment. Her voice was steady, professional. It's teething fever. See the swollen gums? Her temperature is high but not dangerous. She needs cool compresses, willow bark tea if you have it, and rest. The fever will break by morning. Will stared at her. You're sure I nursed my mother through 2 fevers and my sister through scarlet fever? I know the difference. She looked at him directly. Your daughter will live, Mr. Brennan, but she needs care tonight. Can you make willow bark tea? I can make it. Then do that. I'll watch her. Will stood frozen for a moment, caught between disbelief and desperate hope. Rose had been fading for hours. He'd been praying for a miracle, for someone to tell him what to do. And now this woman, this stranger who'd walked 8 miles through a killer blizzard, was calmly giving him instructions like saving dying babies was something she did every Tuesday. Ethan tugged his sleeve. Pa, let her help. Will nodded. Right. Yes. He went to the kitchen, started preparing tea. His hands shook as he worked. From relief or fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Probably all 3. Behind him, he heard the woman's voice, soft and low, speaking to Rose. There now, sweetheart. You're going to be all right. I know you don't feel well, but the fever will pass. You just need to rest and drink and let your body heal. That's all. Just rest. Rose made a small sound, not a whimper. Something else. Response, maybe. The first sound she'd made in hours that sounded like life instead of fading. Will's eyes burned. He blinked hard, focusing on the tea. When it was ready, he brought it to the woman. She tested the temperature, nodded approval, then soaked a clean cloth and pressed it gently to Rose's lips. Nothing happened. The woman tried again. And again. Patient. Methodical. Not forcing it, just offering. After the 4th try, Rose's mouth moved. Her lips closed around the cloth. She sucked weakly. That's it, the woman murmured. That's my girl. Good. Very good. Rose drank, really drank. Her small hands curled against the blanket, her eyes opened halfway, focusing on the stranger's face with that serious infant gaze that seemed to look right through you. Will felt something break open in his chest, relief so intense it hurt. For the first time in 8 weeks since Catherine died, since his world had shattered into pieces too small to put back together, he felt something other than despair. The woman kept feeding Rose drop by careful drop until the baby had taken maybe 2 ounces. Then she'd wrapped her up again and held her close, rocking slightly. She'll need to feed again in 2 hours. Small amounts. Her stomach's been empty too long, too much too fast, and she'll vomit it back up. I understand. Will's voice came out rough. Thank you. I don't know how to thank you. You can start by telling me your name. She looked at him with those clear eyes. I assume you're William Brennan, Will. Just Will. All right, Will, I'm Margaret Calloway, but most people call me Maggie. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the chaos. Dishes piled in the sink, children's clothes scattered across furniture. 8 weeks of a widower trying and failing to hold his household together. I see you need more than a nursemaid. Will felt heat creep up his neck. It's been difficult. Since my wife passed. I'm sure it has been. Maggie said it without judgment. Just statement of fact. How many children? 5. Rose is the youngest, 2 months old. Then Michael, Lily, Sarah, and Ethan. Maggie looked at the 4 children, watching from various doorways. They stared back, wary and curious in equal measure. And you arranged for a mail-order bride because I can't do this alone, Will met her eyes. I need help. The children need a mother. I'm not looking for love, Miss Calloway. I'm looking for partnership. Someone capable and steady who can help me raise these children. In exchange, I can offer security, a home, respect, fairness. Maggie studied him for a long moment. Not love. My wife has been dead 8 weeks. Love isn't something I can offer right now. Maybe not ever. I need to be honest about that. I appreciate honesty, Maggie said. And I'm not here looking for romance, Mr. Brennan. I'm here because I needed somewhere to go and you needed help. That's a fair trade. So we understand each other. I think we do. Maggie shifted Rose slightly in her arms. Now I have some questions. Do you drink, number, gamble, number, and hit women or children? Never. Good. Maggie nodded. Then we can work together. I'll care for your children and manage your household. You'll run your ranch and provide for the family. We'll be respectful partners. We'll marry as soon as possible for legal protection, and we'll build something stable for these children. Does that sound acceptable? Will felt like he'd been hit by lightning. She'd been in his house for less than an hour and she was already negotiating terms like a business contract. Most women would have expected romance, courtship, protestations of feeling. Margaret Calloway expected fairness and clarity and honest work. He found himself liking her more than he'd expected to. That sounds acceptable, he said. We marry tomorrow if the storm breaks. Reverend Matthews will perform the ceremony. Tomorrow then. Maggie looked down at Rose, who was sleeping peacefully now, her fever already starting to break. But first we get through tonight. She was right about that. Getting through tonight. Getting through the next hour. Getting through each moment one at a time until morning came and they could figure out what happened next. Will showed Maggie to a chair near the fire. She settled in with Rose, refusing to give the baby up, insisting she'd watch her through the night. Will tried to argue, but Maggie's look stopped him cold. You're exhausted, she said. You need sleep. I've got her. The children had crept closer, forming a loose semicircle around the stranger who'd appeared in their home. Ethan stood at the front, protective. Sarah held Lily's hand tight. Michael hovered behind them, all thumb in his mouth. Are you our new mama? Michael asked suddenly. Everyone froze. Maggie looked at the 3-year-old with those steady eyes. I'm going to be your papa's wife. I'll take care of you like a mama would. But your real mama was someone else. She loved you very much. I could never replace her, and I won't try. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I'm starting to forget what mama smelled like. That's all right, sweetheart. Maggie's voice was gentle. We forget small things, but you remember the important things. That she loved you, that she was kind, that she sang to you. Those memories are what matter. Did your mama die, too? Lily asked. Yes, 2 years ago. And my little sister, a year after that. So I understand how much it hurts. How do you make it stop hurting? Sarah's voice cracked. You don't. Maggie said it honestly. It doesn't stop, but it gets easier. Not better. Easier. You learn to carry the hurt differently. Ethan had been silent through this exchange, watching Maggie with narrowed eyes. Now he spoke. Why did you come here? Really? Maggie met his gaze without flinching. Because I needed a new start. Because your papa needed help. Because sometimes people need each other, and that's not weakness, it's just life. Are you going to leave? Like Mama did. Your mama didn't leave Ethan. She died. It wasn't her choice. Maggie leaned forward slightly. But me, I'm choosing to be here. And I don't break my promises. If I say I'm staying, I'm staying. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Okay, it was acceptance. Tentative and guarded, but acceptance nonetheless. Will felt his throat tighten. These were good children. Hurt children. Children who needed more than he could give them alone. Maybe Margaret Calloway could help. Maybe this arrangement, born of desperation and practical need, could actually work. You should all go to bed, Will said. It's late. Maggie will watch Rose tonight. The children filed back to their rooms, looking over their shoulders at the stranger by the fire. When they were gone, Will and Maggie sat in silence. The storm howled outside. The fire crackled. Rose slept peacefully. Can I ask you something? Will said finally. Of course. Why did you really walk through that storm? You could have waited, been safe. Maggie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was low. Your last letter said Rose was dying. I came because I lost my mother and sister and couldn't do anything to save them. Because I was tired of being powerless. She looked at him. And because you asked if I believed in second chances, I do. This was mine. Will didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just sat with her in the firelight while the storm raged and his children slept and his youngest daughter breathed easy for the first time in days. What Margaret Calloway didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her arrival had already changed everything. In a town called Milford Creek, people were starting to talk. The mail-order bride had arrived, the widow Brennan barely cold in her grave, the children being raised by a stranger. And in a large house on the hill, Silas Thornton sat in his study looking at a telegram he'd received 3 days ago. A telegram from a contact in Boston about a woman named Margaret Calloway, daughter of Thomas Calloway, railroad surveyor. Thomas Calloway, who'd discovered something he shouldn't have discovered, who'd died before he could report what he'd found. Silas crumpled the telegram in his fist. The Calloway girl was here, in his town, probably carrying her father's documents, documents that could destroy everything Silas had built. He'd have to do something about that, something permanent. But first he'd let his wife handle things. Beatrice was good at destroying reputations, and a destroyed reputation made everything else so much easier. Silas smiled and threw the telegram into his fire. By the time he was finished, Margaret Calloway would wish she'd died in that blizzard. The night passed slowly. Margaret dozed in the chair, waking every 2 hours to feed Rose. Each time the baby took more. Her color improved. Her fever dropped. By dawn, she was sleeping peacefully, deeply, the way healthy babies slept. Will woke to find Margaret at the stove cooking breakfast. Rose was in a basket on the table, gurgling happily. The other children were setting places, moving quietly around the stranger who'd become part of their home in the space of one night. "You should have woken me," Will said. "You needed sleep." Maggie cracked eggs into a pan with practiced efficiency. "Besides, I was awake." Will watched her work. Efficient, competent, no wasted motion. She'd tied her hair back in a practical bun. Her dress was plain but clean. She looked like she'd been part of this kitchen for years instead of hours. "The storm's passed," Will said. "We can go to town today. Get married if you're still willing." "I'm still willing." Maggie flipped the eggs. "Are you?" Will thought about his children fed and calm for the first time in weeks. He thought about Rose healthy and alive. He thought about Margaret Calloway walking 8 miles through a blizzard to save a child she'd never met. "Yes," he said. "I'm willing." "Then let's do it properly." Maggie brought plates to the table. "Sit, eat. Then we'll go to town and make this official." They ate together, all 7 of them. It was the first real meal Will's family had shared since Catherine died. Margaret didn't try to fill the silence with chatter. She just ate and made sure the children ate and acted like this was normal. Like families formed themselves overnight all the time. Like love grew from necessity instead of romance, and that was perfectly acceptable. After breakfast, Will hitched the wagon. The roads were terrible, snow piled high but passable. Margaret wrapped Rose in blankets and climbed up beside Will. The other children piled him back. As they rode toward Milford Creek, Will snuck glances at the woman beside him. She sat straight-backed, eyes forward, hands folded in her lap. Composed. Contained. Not what he'd expected when he'd placed that advertisement. But then again, nothing about Margaret Calloway was what he'd expected. And maybe that was exactly what he needed. In town, people stopped and stared as the Brennan wagon rolled down Main Street. Will felt their eyes, heard the whispers starting already. He'd known this would happen. Small towns had long memories and sharp tongues. He pulled up in front of the church, helped Margaret down. Together they walked up the steps. Reverend Matthews was in his office writing Sunday's sermon. He looked up when Will knocked, eyes widening slightly at the sight of Margaret. "Will, and this must be Miss Calloway." "Margaret Calloway," Maggie said. "Soon to be Margaret Brennan, if you'll perform the ceremony." The Reverend set down his pen. "You're certain about this, both of you?" "We're certain," Will said. "Very well." Matthews stood. "Let me get my book." The ceremony was quick, simple. No decorations or music or celebration. Just Will and Margaret standing before God, and the Reverend making promises they intended to keep. "Do you, William Brennan, take Margaret Calloway to be your lawful wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Margaret Calloway, take William Brennan to be your lawful wedded husband?" "I do. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Will leaned in, gave Margaret a brief, respectful kiss on the forehead. Not the lips. That felt too intimate, too soon. She seemed to understand, accepted it without comment. They were turning to leave when the church door opened and Beatrice Thornton walked in with two other women, their faces set in expressions of righteous disapproval. Reverend Matthews Beatrice said loudly, "I must protest. This marriage is unseemly." Will felt Margaret stiffen beside him. He put a hand on her arm, not restraining, just present. "Mrs. Thornton," the Reverend said carefully, "the ceremony is complete. Catherine Brennan has been dead barely 2 months." Beatrice's voice carried through the church. "This woman arrives, and within a day, they're married. It's indecent, Mrs. Thornton." Will kept his voice level. "My private affairs are not your concern. They are when they concern the moral character of this community." Beatrice turned her gaze on Margaret. "This woman is a stranger. We know nothing about her. For all we know, she could be running from something, someone." Margaret stepped forward, calm as still water. "For all you know, Mrs. Thornton, I'm a respectable woman who answered an honest advertisement. Mr. Brennan needed help. I needed a home. We've made a practical arrangement. If you find that offensive, that's unfortunate. But it's not illegal." "Practical?" Beatrice sneered. "How cold. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" Before Will could respond, Ethan appeared in the doorway, small for 9 but standing tall. "My ma told me before she died that Pa would need help. She said I should help him find someone good. Miss Margaret saved my baby sister last night. That's good enough for me." The church went silent. Beatrice's face flushed red. She'd been challenged by a child and everyone present had heard it. "A child doesn't understand," Beatrice started. "But I do." The voice came from the back of the church. Old Pete Will's ranch hand stood there. His weathered face was set hard. "I fought alongside Will Brennan at Antietam. I watched him carry wounded men off that field when the shells were still falling. He's got more honor in his little finger than most men have in their whole body. If he says this woman is his wife, that's good enough for me." Doc Carson, who'd arrived behind Pete, nodded. "And she saved Rose Brennan's life last night when I couldn't get there. Medical knowledge like that is rare. Seems to me this town is lucky to have her." Beatrice looked around, realized she was losing. Her mouth tightened into a thin line. "Very well. Welcome to Milford Creek, Mrs. Brennan. I'm sure we'll see much more of each other." It was a threat thinly disguised as courtesy. Everyone heard it. Will took Margaret's arm. "We're leaving." Outside, Margaret was shaking. Not obviously, but Will felt it in the tension of her muscles, the too careful way she climbed into the wagon. "I'm sorry," he said. "Beatrice Thornton is poisoned, but she has influence. I'm used to judgment." Margaret's voice was steady despite the shaking. "Let's go home." Home. She'd called his ranch home already. Will didn't know if that was calculation or hope or simple pragmatism, but something about it settled warm in his chest. They rode back in silence, children drowsing in the back, Rose sleeping in Margaret's arms. When they arrived, Margaret looked at the ranch with new eyes, seeing it as hers now, not just a temporary shelter. "It needs work," Will said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the peeling paint, the sagging porch rail, the garden gone to weeds. "Everything needs work," Margaret said. "That's what makes it worth doing." She climbed down, carried Rose inside, and began the process of turning a house back into a home. Will watched her move through rooms that hadn't had a woman's touch in 2 months, straightening and organizing and making space for herself without erasing Catherine's presence. That night, after the children were in bed, Will and Margaret sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table. Between them, the practical business of marriage needed discussing. "I'll take the office," Margaret said. "You keep the main bedroom. The children need that continuity. You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. Catherine's things are in there, her memory. That room was hers. I won't disrespect that by trying to claim it." Will felt something in his chest crack. This woman understood. Without him having to explain, she understood. "Thank you," he said quietly. Margaret stood. "It's late. I should sleep. Tomorrow we start properly." She was at the door when Will called her name. She turned back. "I'm glad you came," he said, "even though it's put you in an awkward position." "I'm glad you're here." "So am I," Margaret said. And then she was gone, disappearing into the office that would be her room, leaving Will alone with his thoughts and his grief and the strange new feeling of hope trying to take root in the ruins of his life. Neither of them knew what was coming. Neither knew that Beatrice Thornton was already spreading poison through the town. that Silas Thornton was laying plans to destroy the woman who threatened his empire, that within days everything would come crashing down around them. But for tonight, for this one night, they had peace. And sometimes peace was enough. The morning after the wedding, Margaret woke before dawn in the small office that was now her room. The narrow cot beneath her was harder than anything she'd slept on in Boston, but she'd slept deeply for the first time in months. No nightmares. No jerking awake in panic, thinking she heard Nathaniel Price's footsteps in the hall. Just sleep, dark and dreamless, and safe. She dressed quickly in the gray light filtering through the single window. Her few possessions were already unpacked and stored in the small dresser. Practical dresses, undergarments, books, her mother's locket, which she fastened around her neck. And hidden beneath a false panel she'd discovered in the dresser's bottom drawer, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, her father's documents. Margaret pulled them out now, unfolding the survey maps in the weak light. Her father's handwriting covered the margins, notes and calculations showing what he'd discovered. The railroad surveys had been tampered with. Someone had altered the measurements, claiming government land as their own, then selling it back to the railroad at inflated prices. Dozens of homesteaders had lost property. The railroad had paid thousands in fraudulent purchases. And the man behind it all had covered his tracks carefully. Almost carefully enough, Thomas Calloway had been meticulous. He'd documented everything. Names, dates, transactions. He'd been building a case to present to the railroad's headquarters in Chicago when he died. Heart failure, the doctor said. But Margaret had found the threatening letters hidden in his desk, letters signed only with initials. S.T. She'd known what those letters meant to do. They were meant to scare her father into silence. Instead, they'd given her a target, someone powerful enough to threaten, someone with enough to lose that they'd kill to protect it. Margaret refolded the documents, returned them to their hiding place. She didn't know yet who S.T. was, but she was in Wyoming territory now. Sooner or later, she'd find out. And when she did, she'd finish what her father started. Voices filtered through the door, children waking, the house coming to life. Margaret smoothed her dress, checked her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. Plain face, practical hair, the kind of woman who blended into backgrounds and drew no particular attention. Perfect. She opened the door and stepped into her new life. The kitchen was chaos. Ethan was trying to make porridge and burning it. Sarah was crying because her doll was missing. Lily was chasing the Michael around the table. Rose was screaming in her basket, red-faced and furious. Will stood in the middle of it all, looking like a man drowning in domestic disaster. Margaret didn't announce herself. She simply moved through the chaos like a ship cutting through rough water. She scooped up Rose, settled her against her shoulder with practiced efficiency. The baby's screams subsided to hiccups. She caught Michael as he ran past, set him firmly in a chair. Lily, sit. Sarah, your doll is on the hearth where you left it last night. Ethan, move. I'll handle breakfast. The children stared at her. Will stared at her. Margaret ignored them all and began cooking. Within 20 minutes, the kitchen was transformed. Hot porridge on the table, sweetened with honey. Fresh bread from yesterday toasted over the fire. Milk for the children. Coffee for Will. Rose fed and content. Everyone seated, everyone eating, everyone quiet. Will watched Margaret move through his kitchen like she'd lived there for years. Efficient, competent. No wasted motion or unnecessary words. She'd assessed the situation, identified the problems, and solved them before anyone could protest or argue. You're good at this, he said. I raised my younger sister after our mother got sick. Margaret didn't look up from feeding Rose. You learn efficiency when there's no one else to help. How old were you? 13 when Mama got sick. 17 when she died. Margaret's voice was matter of fact. My sister was 10. We managed for a year before Mama's husband remarried. Your stepfather. He preferred his new wife's family to his old one. Margaret said it without emotion. Can't say I blamed him. We were reminders of grief. His new wife gave him a fresh start. So he pushed you out. He gave me a choice. Marry his new wife's brother or find somewhere else to live. I chose elsewhere. The brother being Nathaniel Price. Margaret's hands stilled on Rose's blanket. How did you know that name? Your letter mentioned running from an unwanted marriage. I assumed there was a specific man. There was. Margaret resumed feeding Rose. Nathaniel Price, 43 years old, wealthy, connected, used to getting what he wanted. When I refused him, he became insistent. When I continued refusing, he became threatening. What kind of threats? The kind that made me answer advertisements from strangers in Wyoming territory. We'll process that. A powerful man rejected with means and motive to pursue. Did he follow you? I don't think so. Margaret met Will's eyes. But I can't be certain. Men like Nathaniel don't like being told no. They see it as a challenge rather than an answer. If he comes here, Will said carefully, I'll handle it. I can handle myself, Mr. Brennan. Will, and I know you can, but you're my wife now. That means I protect you, whether you need it or not. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them. Not attraction exactly, understanding maybe, recognition. They were both people who'd learned to stand alone. Learning to stand together would take practice. Fair enough, Margaret said finally. But I expect the same courtesy. You need protecting, I'll do it. Despite everything, Will smiled. Deal. The children watched this exchange with wide eyes. They'd never heard their father negotiate with a woman as an equal. Catherine had been sweet and gentle and deferred to Will on everything. This new woman was different. She didn't defer. She negotiated. Ethan leaned towards Sarah and whispered, I think I like her. After breakfast, Margaret established routines. The children would have lessons every morning. Reading, writing, arithmetic. Ethan could already read well. Sarah struggled with letters. Lily needed to learn her alphabet. Michael was too young for formal lessons, but could sit and practice holding a pencil. In the afternoon's chores, appropriate tasks that taught responsibility. Ethan would help Will with ranch work. Sarah and Lily would help Margaret with household tasks. Michael would do small jobs like gathering eggs and feeding chickens. Evenings were for family, dinner together, stories before bed, routine, structure, predictability. The children resisted at first. They'd grown used to chaos in the 8 weeks since Catherine died. But Margaret was patient and unyielding. Rules weren't suggestions. They were requirements, and she enforced them with quiet consistency that left no room for argument. By the third day, the household had transformed. Clean, organized, functioning. The children still grieved their mother, but they grieved within a framework that gave them stability. Will found himself watching Margaret with something close to awe. She'd taken his disaster of a home and turned it into something livable again. Not through magic or miracles, just through relentless practical work. On the fourth day, Margaret announced she needed to go to town for supplies. I'll take you, Will said immediately. You have work here. Margaret was already putting on her coat. I can manage the wagon. The town isn't friendly right now, I noticed. Margaret met his eyes. But hiding won't help. Better to face it directly. Will wanted to argue, but he recognized the set of Margaret's jaw. She'd made up her mind, and arguing with her when she decided something was like arguing with weather. Pointless. Be careful, he said finally. Always. Margaret took the wagon alone, driving the 8 miles to Milford Creek with confidence that came from years of managing horses in Boston. The road was rough, still icy from the storm, but passable. She arrived at midday when the town was busiest. She pulled up in front of the general store. Heads turned, conversations stopped. Margaret ignored the stares and walked inside with her shopping list. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, looked up from his counter. His expression was carefully neutral. Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Peterson. Margaret handed him the list. I need these items. Put them on the Brennan account. Peterson studied the list. Then he looked at Margaret. I'll need to verify the account with your husband first. Mr. Brennan gave me authority to make household purchases. If you need verification, send a boy to the ranch. I'll wait. The store had gone quiet. Other customers pretended to shop while listening to every word. Peterson's jaw tightened. That won't be necessary. He began gathering items from shelves. Margaret waited by the counter, hands folded. Expressions serene. She felt the weight of judgment pressing down from every direction. The whispers, the sideways glances, the assessment of whether she measured up or fell short. She'd felt this before. In Boston after her mother died and the family fell apart. After her stepfather remarried and she became the unwanted reminder of his first wife. After Nathaniel Price started pursuing her and the other women in her social circle began treating her like competition to be eliminated. Margaret had learned that judgment couldn't hurt you if you refused to care about it. So she didn't care. She stood straight-backed and still while Peterson gathered her supplies, and she met every stare with calm indifference. The store door opened. Beatrice Thornton swept in with two other women in tow, their faces set in matching expressions of disapproval. Margaret. Beatrice's voice was honey-sweet and poisonous. How domestic you look. Settling into your new role. Good afternoon, Mrs. Thornton. I heard you were quite forward at the wedding. Speaking out of turn, Beatrice moved closer, circling like a predator. That's not how we do things here in Wyoming. Perhaps in Boston, aggressive behavior is acceptable. But here we value modesty, deference, knowing one's place. Margaret kept her voice level. I spoke honestly, Mrs. Thornton. That's how I do things everywhere. Honesty without decorum is simply rudeness, dear. Beatrice smiled. But I suppose you couldn't have learned proper manners growing up in, where was it, some boarding house? My father's house, actually. Margaret met Beatrice's eyes directly. He was a surveyor for the railroad. Before he passed, for just a moment, something flickered across Beatrice's face. Surprise, or recognition, or fear. It was gone too quickly to identify, but Margaret saw it and filed it away. A surveyor, Beatrice said carefully. How industrious. Well, I'm sure you'll learn our ways soon enough. Or leave. Women from the city rarely last out here. Then I'll be the exception. Beatrice held Margaret's gaze for a long moment. Then she turned sharply and left her companions following like ducklings. Mr. Peterson finished loading supplies into a crate. That'll be $4.30 charged to your account. Thank you. Margaret took the receipt, checked it for accuracy, then nodded. I'll collect these on my way out of town. I have another stop first. She left the store feeling Peterson's eyes on her back. The encounter with Beatrice had confirmed something Margaret had suspected. Mentioning her father's work as a railroad surveyor had triggered a reaction, which meant the Thorntons knew something about railroad surveys, which meant they might be connected to the fraud. She needed to be more careful, but she also needed to investigate. Find out if her instincts were correct. Because if Silas Thornton was the ST from her father's letters, then Margaret had just walked into the lion's den. She headed to Ruth Miller's cafe, the one place in town that had shown her any kindness. Ruth was behind the counter when Margaret entered, and her face brightened immediately. Maggie, she said warmly, using the nickname without asking permission. Come in, sit. You look like you could use coffee. I could use information more than coffee, Margaret said, quietly glancing around to make sure they were alone. What can you tell me about Silas Thornton? Ruth's expression changed immediately. Why do you want to know about Silas? Because Beatrice Thornton reacted strangely when I mentioned my father was a railroad surveyor. And I need to understand why. Ruth poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Silas Thornton owns the bank. He's the biggest landholder in 3 counties. Very wealthy, very powerful, and not a man you want as an enemy. Too late for that, I think. Margaret sipped her coffee. His wife already hates me. Beatrice hates everyone who doesn't bow and scrape. Ruth sat across from Margaret. But Silas is different. He's dangerous in ways Beatrice isn't. If he's taken an interest in you, that's not good. What kind of danger? The kind where people who cross him lose everything. Their land, their businesses, their reputations. Ruth leaned forward. 3 years ago, Samuel Wright lost his ranch to Silas. Foreclosure, supposedly. But Samuel swears the papers were forged, that Silas manipulated the land claims somehow. Margaret's pulse quickened. Land claims. How many others have lost property to Silas? At least a dozen that I know of. Small ranchers mostly. People without the resources to fight back in court. Ruth studied Margaret's face. Why does this matter to you? Because my father investigated land fraud for the railroad before he died. And I think he found something. Something that got him killed. The words hung in the air between them. Ruth's face went pale. Maggie, if you think Silas Thornton is involved in something like that, you need to be very careful. He's not a man who leaves loose ends. I don't leave them either. Margaret finished her coffee. Thank you for the warning and for the information. What are you going to do? What needs to be done? Margaret stood, but carefully, I promise. She collected her supplies from the general store and drove back to the ranch, her mind working through what she'd learned. Silas Thornton, banker, landowner, powerful enough to manipulate claims and foreclosures, connected enough to the railroad to have access to surveys. The pieces fit. But she needed proof, real proof, not just suspicions and secondhand stories. When she arrived home, Will was in the barn. Margaret found him there repairing tack with practiced efficiency. How was town, he asked without looking up. Informative. Margaret leaned against the barn door. What do you know about Silas Thornton? Will's hands stilled on the leather. Why? Because I think he might be connected to the fraud my father discovered, and because I need to know what I'm walking into. Will set down the tack and looked at her directly. Silas Thornton is the most powerful man in 3 counties. He owns the bank, half the town, and has connections to the territorial government. If you're thinking about going after him, you should think again. I'm not going after him. I'm just trying to understand the situation. Maggie. Will stood cross to where she stood. If Thornton is involved in fraud and if he finds out you have evidence, you'll be in danger. Real danger. I'm aware of that. Are you? Will's voice was harder now. Because I've already lost one wife. I'm not interested in losing another. Especially not to something that happened before you even came here. This isn't about you losing anyone. Margaret kept her voice level. This is about finishing what my father started. About justice for people who've been stolen from. About doing what's right even when it's dangerous. Even if it gets you killed, even then. They stared at each other. Will's jaw was tight with frustration. Margaret's chin was lifted in resolute determination. Neither was willing to back down. Finally, Will spoke. If you're going to do this, at least let me help. Don't go after Thornton alone. I'm not going after him at all, not yet. Margaret's voice softened slightly. Right now, I'm just gathering information, understanding the territory. When I'm ready to move, I'll tell you. I promise. Will didn't look satisfied, but he nodded. All right, but you keep that promise, Maggie. No running off alone to be a hero. I'm not a hero, I'm just tenacious. Despite himself, Will smiled. I noticed. That evening after the children were in bed, Margaret and Will sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table. Between them, coffee and the comfortable silence of 2 people learning to coexist. Can I ask you something? Will said. Of course, your father's documents. Do you have them here? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Hidden. Safe. If Thornton finds out, he'll search for them. I know. Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. That's why I need to get them to the railroad's main office in Chicago. Once they're in official hands, Thornton can't make them disappear. How do you plan to do that? I haven't figured that out yet. Margaret looked at Will. Any suggestions? Will thought for a moment. Doc Carson travels to Denver twice a year for medical conferences. Next one's in 3 weeks. He could take the documents, hand them over to railroad officials there. They'd forward them to Chicago. You trust Doc Carson with my life. Will said it without hesitation. He delivered all 5 of my children, saved Catherine's life twice before the fever finally took her. He's a good man. Then we'll ask him. Margaret felt relief wash through her. 3 weeks. She could manage 3 weeks. Keep her head down, avoid attention, play the role of dutiful ranch wife. What she didn't know was that 3 weeks was 2 weeks and 6 days too long. Because Silas Thornton wasn't waiting. He was already moving, already planning, already setting the trap that would force Margaret's hand far sooner than either she or Will expected. The next morning, Sheriff Tom Garrett rode up to the Brennan Ranch with a grim expression. Will met him in the yard, Margaret close behind. Will. Tom dismounted, nodded to Margaret. Mrs. Brennan, what brings you out here, Tom? Need to talk to your wife. Official business. The sheriff's face was apologetic but firm. What kind of business? Will's voice had gone cold. There's been a complaint. The sheriff pulled a paper from his coat. Silas Thornton claims that Mrs. Brennan's father, Thomas Calloway, was employed by the Wyoming Central Railroad to survey land for expansion. When Mr. Calloway died, he left personal documents that are property of the railroad. Mr. Thornton has been authorized by the railroad's legal department to retrieve them. That's a lie, Margaret said immediately. My father's personal papers are mine by inheritance. If the railroad wants them, they can request them through proper legal channels. Silas Thornton says you're holding them illegally. Tom looked uncomfortable. Says keeping them constitutes theft of railroad property. He's got a warrant to search your belongings. We'll step between the sheriff and Margaret. You're not searching anything without proof those documents exist and proof they belong to the railroad. Well, I don't want to do this the hard way. Tom's voice was weary. But I have a legal warrant. I have to execute it. Let him search, Margaret said quietly. I have nothing to hide. Will turned to her eyes questioning. She met his gaze steadily. Trust me. The sheriff searched Margaret's room. He checked her dresser, her carpet bag, the small trunk at the foot of her bed. He found clothes books, personal items. No documents. Nothing here. Mr. Thornton, Tom said, clearly relieved. Silas Thornton had arrived shortly after the sheriff, bringing his authority and his certainty. Now his face darkened with fury. She's hidden them elsewhere. Search the whole house. I will not, Tom said firmly. The warrant specifies her personal belongings. That's what I've searched. There's nothing here. Then she's destroyed them, Silas said, or sent them away. I haven't destroyed anything. Margaret's voice was perfectly calm. And I haven't sent anything away. As I said, Sheriff, I have nothing to hide. Silas turned his cold gaze on her. This isn't over, Mrs. Brennan. If you're hiding evidence of fraud, we'll find out. If there's evidence of fraud, Margaret said carefully, I'm sure the proper authorities will handle it. That's how law works, isn't it? Evidence examined by neutral parties, not by interested individuals. Direct hit. Silas's face went red. You should be very careful, Mrs. Brennan. Accidents happen out here, especially to people who don't understand how things work. Is that a threat? Will's voice was dangerous. It's advice, Silas said coldly. Good day, Sheriff. Mrs. Brennan. Brennan. He left. The sheriff followed, pausing to speak quietly to Will. Watch your back, Will. Silas is powerful and he's angry. That's a bad combination. After they left, Will turned to Margaret. Where are they? The documents somewhere. Thornton will never find them. Margaret's expression gave nothing away. The less you know, the safer you are. Maggie, we're supposed to be partners. That means trust. It also means protection. Margaret met his eyes. If Thornton questions you, you can honestly say you don't know where they are. That protects you and the children. Will wanted to argue, but he recognized the logic and the iron will. Margaret had made up her mind. 3 weeks, he said. Doc leaves in 3 weeks. Can you hold out that long? I can hold out as long as necessary. But holding out, Margaret was learning, was harder than she'd anticipated. Because Silas Thornton wasn't just searching for documents. He was destroying her reputation. Systematically, methodically, with the precision of a man who'd done this before. Beatrice Thornton led the charge. At church socials, in quilting circles, in every social gathering in Milford Creek, she spread poison. Margaret was a fraud, a con artist. She'd trapped poor William Brennan when he was vulnerable. She was probably after his money, running from scandal in Boston, maybe even a criminal. The whispers spread like disease. By the end of the first week, half the town believed them. By the end of the second week, women crossed the street to avoid Margaret. Men tipped their hats but didn't smile. Children were warned to stay away from the Brennan Ranch. Only Ruth Miller and Doc Carson stood firm. And old Pete, who'd known Will long enough to trust his judgment. Margaret endured it all with the same calm composure she'd shown since arriving. She went to town for supplies, attended church with Will and the children, met cold stares with steady eyes, and refused to bow or break. But it wore on her. Late at night, alone in her small room, Margaret allowed herself to feel the weight of it. The isolation, the judgment, the slow grinding pressure of being hated for existing. She thought about her father, about the last conversation they'd had before he died. Maggie, he'd said, his voice weak from the heart that was failing. Being right doesn't make you safe. Sometimes it makes you a target. She'd understood then. She understood better now. On the 15th day, everything changed. Margaret was at Ruth's Cafe, the only place in town where she felt welcome when a stranger walked in. Tall, well-dressed, mid-40s. He looked around the cafe with the assessing eyes of someone used to reading people and situations. His gaze landed on Margaret. Recognition flashed across his face, then calculation. He approached her table. Miss Calloway. Margaret's blood ran cold. No one in Wyoming knew her maiden name. She'd been Margaret Brennan since the day after she arrived. I'm Margaret Brennan, she said carefully. Of course. Forgive me. The man smiled. But you were Margaret Calloway in Boston, weren't you, daughter of Thomas Calloway, the surveyor? Who are you? My name is Whitmore. Silas Thornton hired me to verify some information. He pulled out a chair, sat without invitation. Interesting journey you've had. Boston to Wyoming. Very sudden departure. Some might say suspiciously sudden. I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. There's nothing suspicious about that. No, but there is something suspicious about a woman who leaves Boston 2 days after her father's funeral, carrying documents that don't belong to her, documents that could cause significant legal problems for innocent businessmen. Margaret kept her face carefully neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. No. Whitmore pulled a paper from his coat. Then let me clarify. Your father discovered what he believed was fraud in the railroad surveys. He was building a case against several prominent citizens. Then he died, very conveniently, and you disappeared with his evidence. My father died of heart failure, and I didn't disappear. I moved. There's a difference, is there? Whitmore leaned forward. Here's what I think happened. I think your father was wrong about the fraud. I think he made mistakes in his calculations, and I think you know it. But instead of admitting those mistakes, you're trying to use false evidence to extort money from innocent people. That's a lie, is it? Because Mr. Thornton has proof that your father was unstable in his final months, delusional even, making wild accusations without basis. And here you are, his daughter, continuing his delusions. My father was brilliant and honest and right about everything he found. Then prove it. Whitmore sat back. Show me the documents. Let neutral experts examine them. If they're legitimate, you have nothing to fear. And if I refuse, then we'll have to assume you're hiding something. And hiding evidence is a crime, Miss Calloway. Or should I say Mrs. Brennan? Does your husband know about your criminal activities? There are no criminal activities. We'll see. Whitmore stood. You have until tomorrow noon. Bring the documents to the sheriff's office for examination. Or face charges, your choice. He left. Margaret sat frozen, her mind racing. This was worse than she'd anticipated. Whitmore wasn't just threatening her reputation. He was threatening criminal prosecution, which meant Thornton was escalating, getting desperate, which meant her father's documents were more dangerous than she'd realized. Ruth appeared at her elbow, having watched the whole exchange. Maggie, what's going on? Margaret looked at her friend and decided Ruth deserved the truth, all of it. 20 minutes later, Ruth knew everything about Thomas Calloway's investigation, about the documents proving fraud, about Silas Thornton being the likely suspect, about the threats that had driven Margaret from Boston. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You need to leave tonight. Take those documents and run. I won't run. Maggie, if Silas Thornton is behind fraud big enough to murder over, he won't hesitate to hurt you. You have to get those documents to Chicago immediately. I can't. Margaret's voice was steady. Doc Carson doesn't leave for Denver for another week, and I need his help to get the documents safely out of Wyoming. Then hide. At least until Doc leaves, I won't hide either. Margaret met Ruth's eyes. Running and hiding is what got me here. I'm done with that. It's time to stand and fight. Even if it kills you, even then. Ruth stared at her, then shook her head. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish, probably both, Margaret said. But I'm done letting bullies win. She drove back to the ranch, her mind working through options. Whitmore had given her until noon tomorrow. That gave her one night to decide surrender the documents or call Thornton's bluff. She was still weighing her options when she arrived home and found Will in the barn, his face dark with worry. We need to talk, he said without preamble. I know. I met one of Thornton's men in town. Tom Garrett was here. Will's voice was tight. Thornton's filing formal charges. Says you stole railroad documents. Says you're holding them illegally. He's convinced the territorial judge to issue a warrant for your arrest. Margaret felt the world tilt. Arrest. They're escalating faster than I expected. What are you going to do? What I should have done from the start. Margaret's jaw set with resolve. I'm going to Denver myself, tonight. I'll deliver the documents directly to the railroad office. Once they're in official hands, Thornton can't touch them. You can't travel to Denver alone. It's 60 miles of rough country. Then come with me. I can't leave the children. Then I'll take old Pete. Margaret was already moving toward the house, planning. We leave at dark, travel through the night, arrive in Denver by dawn. Hand over the documents and come home. Maggie, this is dangerous. More dangerous than staying here and letting Thornton arrest me. Margaret turned to face Will. If he gets those documents, he'll destroy them. And everyone my father tried to protect will lose everything. I can't let that happen. Will stared at her, saw the fortitude burning behind her eyes. Knew arguing was pointless. Then at least let me prepare. Get Pete ready. Pack supplies. You don't go into the mountains in winter unprepared. Fine. But we leave tonight. No delays. No delays, Will agreed. What neither of them knew was that Silas Thornton had anticipated exactly this move. That he'd already sent men to watch the ranch. That the moment Margaret and old Pete rode out, those men would follow. And that by tomorrow night, one of them would be dead and Margaret would be fighting for her life in ways she'd never imagined. But for now, in this moment, Margaret Brennan felt something she hadn't felt since her father died. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could finish what he'd started. That justice could still prevail. That standing up to powerful men who did wrong things could actually make a difference. She packed quickly and efficiently. Warm clothes, the documents in their oilcloth wrapping, a small amount of food, her father's compass. Will appeared in her doorway as she finished. Pete's ready, horses saddled. I packed extra supplies in this. He held out a small revolver. Do you know how to use it? My father taught me. Margaret took the gun, checked the chamber with practiced ease. Hoped I'd never need to. Hope you still don't. But if trouble comes, don't hesitate. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not love. They weren't there yet. But partnership. Trust. The recognition that they were in this together now for better or worse. Be careful, Will said. Always. Come back. It wasn't a request. It was something deeper. Necessity, maybe? Or the beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name. I will, Margaret promised. She kissed each child goodbye while they slept. Ethan stirred when she touched his forehead, opening his eyes slightly. Ma, he mumbled, still half asleep. Where you going? Just a trip. I'll be back soon. Go back to sleep, sweetheart. Love you, Ma. Margaret's throat tightened. Love you too, Ethan. She met old Pete at the barn. He was mounted and ready, his weathered face set with grim resolve. Ready for an adventure, Mrs. Brennan, something like that. They rode out into darkness, following the mountain road toward Denver. Behind them, Will stood in the doorway of his home, watching until they disappeared into shadow. He didn't see the two riders who emerged from the trees a quarter-mile away. Didn't hear them kick their horses into motion, following Margaret and Pete at a careful distance. But he felt the wrongness of the night, felt the weight of decisions made and consequences coming. Felt fear for his wife, this strange woman who'd walked into his life through a blizzard and was now riding toward danger with the same iron courage. Well, Brennan wasn't a praying man anymore. Catherine's death had taken that from him. But tonight he prayed anyway, for Margaret's safety, for justice, for the chance to build something real with this woman who refused to bend or break no matter what the world threw at her. In town, Silas Thornton received word that Margaret Brennan had left the ranch. He smiled coldly and sent a telegram to his men in the mountains. Stop her, retrieve the documents. Whatever it takes. And in Denver, the railroad office sat dark and empty, unaware that by morning they'd received documents that would expose the biggest land fraud in territorial history. If Margaret survived the night to deliver them. The mountain pass was darker than anything Margaret had experienced. The kind of dark that felt solid, pressing in from all sides like something alive and malevolent. The moon hung behind thick clouds, offering no light. The stars were invisible. Only the narrow beam of old Pete's lantern provided any guidance, swinging with each step of his horse. They'd been riding for 3 hours. The cold had seeped through Margaret's coat, through her dress, into her bones. Her injured leg throbbed with each jarring movement. But she kept her complaints to herself. This was her choice, her mission, her burden. Pete rode ahead silent, except for occasional grunts of direction. Left here. Careful of the rocks. Watch the ice. He knew these mountains like Will knew his ranch. Every switchback, every dangerous drop, every place where the trail narrowed to nothing and one wrong step meant falling into darkness. Margaret followed, trusting Pete's judgment because she had no choice. Her world had narrowed to the horse beneath her, the documents in her saddlebag, and the singular purpose of getting to Denver before Thornton could stop her. They were halfway through the pass when Pete suddenly reined in his horse. His hand went up. Stop. Margaret halted immediately. What is it? Pete turned in his saddle, his weathered face troubled in the lantern light. Riders, behind us, been following for the last mile. Margaret's heart kicked. How many? 2, maybe 3. Staying back. but closing distance. Thornton's men. That'd be my guess. Pete's hand dropped to his rifle. We can try to outrun them, or we can face them here. Margaret looked around. The pass was narrow, rocky walls on both sides. No place to hide, no place to maneuver. If they ran, they'd be exposed on the trail. If they stood and fought, at least they'd have defensive position. We face them, she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. You sure could be we're wrong, could be just travelers. In the middle of the night, through the most dangerous pass in Wyoming, Margaret shook her head. They're Thornton's men, and they're here for the documents. Pete studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, you get off the trail. Hide behind those rocks. I'll handle this. No. Margaret's hand went to the revolver Will had given her. We handle it together. Mrs. Brennan, I've been in gunfights before. You ain't. I've been in worse fights than you can imagine. Margaret dismounted, led her horse behind a boulder. And I'm done hiding while other people protect me. Pete opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He'd known unyielding people before, but Margaret Brennan was something else entirely. Not reckless, not fearless, just absolutely unwilling to back down once she decided something. He positioned himself behind another rock rifle ready. Your husband finds out I let you do this, he'll kill me. Then we better survive so you can explain it was my choice. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Then visible in the darkness, two shapes on horseback emerged around the bend. Pete stood rifle aimed. That's far enough. The rider stopped. One of them, a tall man with a scarred face, raised his hands in mock surrender. Easy, old man. We're not looking for trouble. Then turn around and ride back where you came from. Can't do that. The second rider spoke now. Younger, meaner looking. We got business with the lady. The lady's not available for business. Pete's voice was flat. Now move along. See, that's the problem. The scarred man smiled without warmth. Our employer says the lady's got something that belongs to him. We're just here to collect it. Your employer can go to hell. Probably will eventually. But first, we're taking those documents. The man's hand dropped toward his gun. You can make this easy or hard. Your choice. Pete didn't wait for him to draw. He fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the narrow pass. The scarred man's horse reared. The man fell, clutching his shoulder. The second rider drew and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet caught Pete high in the chest. He staggered backwards, surprise flashing across his face. Margaret screamed and fired. She'd never shot at a person before, but her father had taught her to shoot straight, and she didn't miss. The bullet hit the second rider's hand. He dropped his gun with a howl of pain. Both riders spurred their horses forward, the wounded one toward Margaret, the other toward Pete. Margaret fired again. Missed. The rider was almost on top of her when Pete, bleeding and barely standing, fired his rifle one more time. The bullet took the rider in the leg. He fell from his horse, hitting the ground hard. The scarred man, still mounted, looked at his fallen companion, then at Pete and Margaret, then at the blood spreading across his own shoulder. He made a calculation. 2 wounded partners. 2 armed opponents who'd already proven they could shoot. Documents that weren't worth dying for. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Margaret ran to Pete. He was on the ground now, blood spreading dark across his shirt. His breathing came in wet gasps. Pete. Oh God, Pete. The old ranch hand's eyes were unfocused. I'm shot. Pretty bad, ain't I? You're going to be fine. Margaret's hands were already working, tearing cloth from her petticoat to make bandages. We'll get you to a doctor. No time for that. Pete coughed. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. You got to go. Get those documents to Denver. I'm not leaving you. Yes, you are. Pete grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. This is bigger than me. Bigger than both of us. Those documents can save dozens of families. You finish this. You hear me, Pete, please? Promise me. His grip tightened. Promise you'll finish it. Margaret looked at the man who'd fought beside her, who'd taken a bullet meant to protect her, who was dying so she could complete a mission he didn't fully understand but believed in anyway. I promise. Good. Pete's grip loosened. Tell Will I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. You saved my life. Yeah, well, that's what friends do. Pete's eyes were drifting closed. You tell those railroad folks what Thornton did. You make sure justice gets served. I will. and Maggie Pete's voice was barely a whisper now. "You're one hell of a woman. Will's lucky to have you." Those were his last words. Pete's breathing slowed, stopped. His eyes stayed open, staring at stars he couldn't see anymore. Margaret knelt beside him in the dirt and the blood and let herself cry. Not for long. She couldn't afford long. But for a moment, she allowed herself to grieve this man who'd barely known her but had died protecting her anyway. The second rider was still alive, groaning on the ground. Margaret stood, walked over to him. He looked up at her with pain-glazed eyes. "You killed him," Margaret said. Her voice was cold, flat, empty of everything except rage. "Was just doing a job," the man gasped. "Nothing personal. You made it personal when you shot an innocent man." Margaret pointed her revolver at his head. "Give me one reason I shouldn't finish what you started." The man's eyes widened. "You won't. You're not a killer." Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger. She wanted to pull it, wanted to end this man who'd taken Pete's life, wanted justice, vengeance, blood for blood. But Pete's words echoed in her mind. "Finish this. Get those documents to Denver. Justice through law, not murder." She lowered the gun. "You're right. I'm not a killer. But when the law catches up with you, you'll wish I was." She checked his wounds. Painful but not fatal. She left him there with his horse and enough supplies to survive. If he made it back to civilization, fine. If he didn't, that was between him and God. Margaret turned to Pete's body. She couldn't bury him properly. Not here. Not alone. But she couldn't leave him in the dirt either. She dragged him to the side of the trail, covered him with his coat, marked the spot with a cairn of rocks. "I'll come back for you," she promised. "I'll make sure you get home." Then she mounted her horse and rode toward Denver alone, carrying the weight of Pete's death on her shoulders alongside her father's documents. The remaining miles to Denver passed in a blur of grief and exhaustion and relentless forward motion. Margaret stopped only once at a small mining town called Silver Creek to rest her horse and check her wounds. She'd been grazed by a bullet she hadn't even felt during the fight. The wound was minor but needed cleaning. A grizzled doctor in Silver Creek patched her up without asking questions, took one look at her blood-stained dress and haunted eyes and knew better than to pry. "You got trouble following you?" he asked as he bandaged her arm. "Yes." "Then you better keep moving. Silver Creek don't get involved in other folks' problems." "I understand." The doctor handed her a bottle of laudanum. "For the pain. Don't take too much. Makes you fuzzy." Margaret pocketed the bottle. "Thank you." She was back on her horse within an hour, riding hard toward Denver. The sun was rising when she finally saw the city spread out below buildings, catching the first light of dawn. She'd made it. Against impossible odds, through violence and death and her own refusal to quit, she'd made it. The Wyoming Central Railroad office was in the business district, a 3-story brick building with the company name in gold letters above the door. Margaret tied her horse outside and walked in her carpet bag clutched tight, her appearance drawing stares from the clerks. She knew what she looked like. Blood on her dress, dirt on her face, hair falling loose from its pins, eyes wild with exhaustion and grief. She looked like a woman who'd ridden through hell, which was accurate. "I need to see the chief surveyor," she said to the first clerk she encountered. Immediately. The clerk, a young man with slicked hair and a superior expression, looked her up and down. "The chief surveyor doesn't see people without appointments. Make an exception." "Ma'am, I'm afraid that's not possible." Margaret slammed her carpet bag onto his desk. Inside are documents proving land fraud in Wyoming territory. Documents that show your company has been paying inflated prices for stolen land. Documents that could save you thousands of dollars and protect dozens of homesteaders from losing everything they own. Now get the chief surveyor, or I take these documents to the Denver Post and let them publish the story of how the Wyoming Central Railroad ignored evidence of massive fraud. The clerk's face went pale. He stood. One moment. 5 minutes later, Margaret was in the office of Arthur Whitman, chief surveyor for the Wyoming Central Railroad. He was a man in his 50s with iron gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Brennan," he gestured to a chair. "Please sit. You look like you've had a difficult journey." "That's an understatement." Margaret sat, placing her carpet bag on the desk. "My father was Thomas Calloway. He worked for you 5 years ago." Tom Calloway. Whitman's expression changed immediately. "One of the best surveyors I ever employed. I was devastated when I heard he'd passed." He died before he could complete his final investigation. Margaret opened the bag, pulled out the documents. But he documented everything he found. And what he found was fraud. She spread the maps and correspondence across Whitman's desk. For the next hour, she walked him through her father's evidence. The falsified surveys, the manipulated land claims, the pattern of theft that had been ongoing for years. And at the center of it all, one name appearing again and again, Silas Thornton. Whitman studied the documents with growing alarm. If this is accurate, he said slowly, we're talking about dozens of illegal transactions, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent purchases. It's accurate. Margaret's voice was steady despite her exhaustion. My father was meticulous. He checked and rechecked everything. This isn't speculation, it's proof. Whitman looked at her. Where did you get these? My father left them to me when he died. I've been carrying them for 6 months, waiting for the right time to come forward. And the right time is now. The right time was 6 months ago. But Thornton found out I had them. He's been trying to destroy me to keep them hidden. Last night, his men ambushed me and my escort. They killed a good man. Margaret's voice hardened. So yes, the right time is now, before anyone else dies. Whitman was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to his window, looking out over Denver. Silas Thornton is one of our biggest investors. He has connections to the territorial government, friends in high places. If we act on this, there will be consequences. Then let there be consequences. Margaret stood as well. Justice isn't supposed to be convenient, Mr. Whitman. It's supposed to be right. Whitman turned back to face her. You understand what you're doing. If we pursue this, Thornton will come after you. He has resources, power. He could destroy your reputation, your marriage, your life. He's already tried. Margaret met his eyes. I've lost my father. I've lost a friend. I've been threatened, hunted, and shot at. I have nothing left to lose except my integrity. And that's not for sale. Whitman studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, Mrs. Brennan. I'll forward these documents to our legal department and to federal authorities. We'll start an investigation immediately, and I'll make sure your name is protected as much as possible. I don't need protection. I need justice. You'll get both if I have anything to say about it. Whitman extended his hand. Thank you for your courage. Your father would be proud. Margaret shook his hand, then collapsed. She woke in a Denver hotel room with no memory of how she got in there. Whitman was sitting in a chair by the window reading through documents. He looked up when she stirred. Easy. You've been out for 6 hours. Doctor says you were running on nothing but will and grit. Your body finally gave out. The document's safe, already in the hands of federal marshals. Whitman set the papers aside. You did it, Mrs. Brennan. The investigation is official. Thornton can't stop it now. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling relief wash through her like warm water. It's done. Almost. You still need to get home, and you need to tell your husband what happened. He's been sending frantic telegrams. Margaret sat up, ignoring the protests of her aching body. I need to send a telegram back. Tell him I'm safe. Already done. Whitman pointed to the desk where a telegram form lay. I took the liberty. Told him you were in Denver, documents delivered and coming home. Didn't mention the ambush or that you were injured. Figured you could tell him that in person. Thank you. There's one more thing. Whitman's expression turned serious. The wounded man from the ambush. He made it to a town and told his story to the local sheriff. He's claiming you murdered Pete Dawson in cold blood, that you attacked them without provocation. That's a lie. Pete was killed protecting me. I know. But it's his word against yours. And without Pete here to corroborate your version, things could get complicated. Whitman leaned forward. I'm saying this as someone who wants to help. When you get back to Milford Creek, be very careful. Thornton's going to use every weapon he has, including the law. Let him try. Margaret rested for one more day in Denver, regaining strength and planning her return. Whitman arranged for her to travel with a freight wagon heading back to Wyoming, driven by a man he trusted. Safer than riding alone. The journey home took 2 days. 2 days of rumbling over rough roads, of sleeping under stars, of thinking about Pete and her father, and everything that had led to this moment. She arrived in Milford Creek at sunset 3 days after she left. The wagon dropped her at the edge of town. Margaret walked down Main Street with her carpet bag and her weary resolve, and she felt every eye in town watching her. Word had already spread. The mail-order bride who'd caused trouble, who'd gotten old Pete killed, who was probably a criminal herself. The whispers followed her like smoke. Margaret ignored them all. She walked straight to the sheriff's office. Tom Garrett looked up when she entered, his expression complex. Relief mixed with worry, mixed with something that might have been respect. Maggie, you're back, I'm back, and I'm here to give my statement about what happened in the mountains. I heard a different version already. From Jake Harlan, he says you and Pete ambushed him and his partner. He's lying. Margaret sat down without invitation. His partner shot Pete. I shot back in self-defense. Pete died protecting me from men who were trying to steal documents on Silas Thornton's orders. Can you prove that? Not without Pete's testimony. But the federal marshals have the documents now. They're investigating Thornton for land fraud. I imagine that investigation will uncover proof of what his men were ordered to do. Tom rubbed his face with both hands. This is a mess, Maggie. A hell of a mess. Justice usually is. Margaret's voice was steady. Are you going to arrest me? Should I? That depends on whether you believe Jake Harlan or me. Tom looked at her for a long moment. I believe you. But that doesn't matter if Thornton convinces the territorial judge otherwise. He's already calling for your arrest. Says you're a dangerous criminal who needs to be stopped. Then let him call. Margaret stood. I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I did what was right, and I'll stand behind it. Even if it costs you everything. Even then. She left the sheriff's office and walked to Ruth's cafe. Ruth saw her coming and ran outside, pulling Margaret into a fierce hug. Thank God. I thought you were dead. When we heard about Pete, I thought they'd killed you too. They tried. Margaret pulled back, managed a tired smile. But I'm harder to kill than I look. You are also braver than anyone I've ever met. Ruth ushered her inside. Come on, you need food and rest and to tell me everything. Over coffee and beef stew, Margaret told the story. The ambush, Pete's death, the ride to Denver, delivering the documents, the investigation that was now underway. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she was quiet for a moment. You know Thornton won't let this stand, she said finally. He'll fight back. I'm counting on it. Maggie, he could destroy you. He could try. Margaret met Ruth's eyes. But I'm done being afraid. Fear is what he counts on, what all men like him count on. They think if they threaten enough, intimidate enough, people will back down. But I won't, not anymore. What about Will, the children? They'll be safer with Thornton exposed than they ever were with him hiding in shadows. Margaret's voice was certain. Once the investigation is complete, once his fraud is public record, he'll have no reason to target us anymore, unless he wants revenge. Then he'll have to get in line. Margaret's smile was grim. I've got a lot of people who want revenge on me lately. What's one more? She finished her meal and walked the rest of the way to the ranch. It was full dark now, stars brilliant overhead, the air cold and clean. She could see lights in the ranch house windows, warm and welcoming. Will must have been watching for her because the door opened before she reached it. He stood in the doorway, backlit by firelight, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then Margaret said, I'm home. And Will crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. He didn't say anything, didn't ask questions or demand explanations, just held her like she was something precious. He'd thought he'd lost. Margaret leaned into him, letting herself be held, letting herself feel safe for the first time in days. When they finally pulled apart, Will's eyes were bright with emotion. Pete, he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. I'm sorry, he died protecting me. Will closed his eyes. Pain crossed his face. He was a good man. The best, Margaret's voice cracked. He made me promise to finish the mission. So I did. The documents delivered. The investigation is official. Thornton can't stop it now. Good. Will took her hand. Come inside. The children have been beside themselves. The moment Margaret walked through the door, she was mobbed. Ethan grabbed her around the waist. Sarah and Lily attached themselves to her legs. Michael toddled over to shouting, Mama home, Mama home. Even baby Rose, held by Ruth, who'd followed Margaret from town, reached out with chubby hands. Margaret knelt down and gathered them all close, breathing in the smell of children and home and safety. I missed you. I missed all of you so much. We thought you weren't coming back, Sarah said through tears, like Mama Catherine. I promised I'd come back, didn't I? Margaret pulled back to look at each child. And I keep my promises. Always, Lily asked. Always. They had a late dinner together, all of them crowded around the table. Margaret told an edited version of the story, leaving out the worst of the violence. The children listened with wide eyes. You're a hero, Ethan said when she finished. I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done. That's what heroes say. Sarah said seriously. After the children were in bed, Will and Margaret sat by the fire. Margaret told him the real story, all of it. Pete's death, the wounded man she'd spared, the ride to Denver, the investigation that was now underway. Will listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You could have died, he said finally. But I didn't. You could have. Will turned to look at her, and then what? My children lose another mother. I lose another wife. We're not talking about another wife. Margaret kept her voice gentle. We're talking about justice, about doing what's right even when it's dangerous. I don't care about justice. Will's voice was rough. I care about you. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at him. Will stared back, looking almost surprised at what he'd said. What Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. I care about you. Will said it again, stronger this time. I know it's too soon. I know I'm not supposed to feel this way. Catherine's only been gone 3 months. But I can't help it. These last 3 days thinking you might be dead, it nearly broke me. And I realized something. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being an arrangement. This became real. Will, I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I know you came here for practical reasons, but I needed you to know that you matter to me, that you're not just my housekeeper or the children's caretaker. You're my partner, my wife, and I want you to be safe, even if that means giving up on justice. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I can't give up on justice. My father died for it. Pete died for it. Too many people have lost too much for me to just walk away. I know. Will reached out, took her hand. And I wouldn't ask you to. I'm just saying be careful, because you matter. To me, to the children, to this family. Margaret squeezed his hand. I'll be as careful as I can be, but I won't back down. Not now. I wouldn't expect you to. Will smiled slightly. You're the most resolute woman I've ever met. Is that a complaint? It's an observation. One of many I've made about you, such as you're brave and smart and kind. You're good with the children. You work harder than anyone I know. You stand up for what's right even when it costs you. Will's voice softened. And somewhere along the way, I fell for you. I wasn't planning to. Wasn't ready for it. But it happened anyway. Margaret felt something in her chest crack open. I fell for you too. I don't know when exactly. Maybe when you stood up for me in church. Maybe when you gave me your gun and told me to be careful. Maybe it was gradual building over days of working together and raising the children together and just being partners. But somewhere along the way, this became more than an arrangement for me too. They sat close, hands clasped, looking at each other in the firelight. Then Will leaned in and kissed her. Not the brief, respectful kiss from their wedding. Something deeper. Real. Full of all the feelings they'd been holding back. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Too soon, Will asked. Probably, Margaret smiled. But I don't care. Good. Because I don't either. That night, Margaret slept in Will's arms for the first time. Not in the main bedroom where Catherine's memory still lingered, but on the couch by the fire, wrapped in blankets, holding each other like they were afraid to let go. It was healing, that closeness. For both of them. Two people who'd lost so much, finding comfort in each other. Building something new without forgetting what came before. The next morning brought reality crashing back. Sheriff Garrett arrived with federal marshals. They had questions about the ambush, about Pete's death, about the documents Margaret had delivered. Margaret answered everything honestly, calmly, with Will at her side and the children watching from doorways. The marshals seemed satisfied. They told her the investigation into Thornton was proceeding, that charges would likely be filed within the week, that her testimony would be crucial. They also told her that Silas Thornton had filed countercharges, claiming Margaret had stolen the documents, that she'd murdered Pete to cover her tracks, that she was a criminal who should be arrested immediately. It's nonsense, one of the marshals said. But Thornton has influence. We need to follow proper procedure, which means what Will asked, his voice dangerous. which means Mrs. Brennan needs to remain available for questioning. No traveling outside the territory. Report any threats immediately, and be very, very careful. After they left, Will turned to Margaret. He's not going to stop, I know. He'll use every weapon he has. I know that too. Then what do? We prepare. Margaret's jaw was set. We gather our allies, we make sure our story is told, and we wait for the investigation to expose the truth. What if the truth doesn't matter? What if Thornton's power is stronger than evidence? Then we fight harder. Margaret met his eyes, because the alternative is letting him win. And I'm not doing that. Over the next week, battle lines were drawn. Silas Thornton used his influence to spread his version of events. The dangerous mail-order bride, the murdered ranch hand, the stolen documents. He painted Margaret as a criminal and himself as a victim. But the investigation kept moving forward. Federal marshals interviewed homesteaders who'd lost land, examined records, followed the money trail, and slowly, methodically, they built a case that even Thornton's influence couldn't derail. Doc Carson testified about being falsely arrested to prevent him from helping Margaret. Ruth Miller testified about Thornton's threats. Samuel Wright and other ranchers testified about losing their land under suspicious circumstances. And Arthur Whitman testified about Thomas Calloway's documentation. The meticulous, undeniable proof of fraud that had cost Thornton hundreds of thousands of dollars in ill-gotten gains. The tide was turning, slowly, but definitely. Then Silas Thornton made his final desperate move. He sent men to kidnap Margaret. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was at Ruth's cafe discussing strategy for the upcoming hearing. Ruth had just poured fresh coffee when the door burst open and 3 men entered. 2 were strangers. The third was Jake Harlan, the wounded man from the ambush, his hand still bandaged. Margaret Brennan Harlan said, "You're coming with us." Margaret stood slowly. "On whose authority? Mr. Thornton's authority. We got questions about those documents you stole. I stole nothing, and I'm not going anywhere with you." "Wasn't a request." Harlan nodded to the other men. They moved forward. Ruth stepped between them and Margaret. "You touch her and I'll shoot you myself. Old woman, you don't want this trouble." "I'm already in the trouble." Ruth's voice was steel. "Maggie's my friend. You go through me to get to her." For a moment, it looked like violence would erupt right there in the cafe. Then Sheriff Tom Garrett walked in, gun drawn. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Harlan, you and your boys get out of my town. Now." "Sheriff, we got authorization from Mr. Thornton. I don't care if you got authorization from God himself. You're not taking Mrs. Brennan anywhere. Now move." The men looked at Harlan. He looked at the sheriff. Calculation crossed his face. Then he nodded. "This ain't over," he said to Margaret. "It is for today." Tom kept his gun trained on them until they left. Then he holstered it and turned to Margaret. "You all right? I'm fine." "Thank you. You need to be more careful." Tom's face was grim. "Thornton's getting desperate. Desperate men do stupid things, I know." Margaret managed a smile. "But I'm not backing down. Didn't think you would? Just be smart about it." That night, Will insisted Margaret stay close to the ranch. No more trips to town alone. No more taking chances. If she needed to go somewhere, he'd go with her. Or Ruth would come to the ranch instead. Margaret wanted to argue, but she saw the fear in his eyes. The memory of Pete's death. The knowledge that he'd already lost one wife and couldn't bear to lose another. So she agreed. For him, for the children, for the family they were building together. 5 days later, the federal marshals arrested Silas Thornton. They did it at noon in the middle of Main Street where everyone could see. Thornton emerged from his bank to find marshals waiting. He tried to bluster to threaten to call in favors, but the marshals had warrants signed by a federal judge. Charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Beatrice Thornton watched from the bank's doorway, her face white with shock. For years, she'd been the moral authority of Milford Creek. Now her husband was being arrested in front of the entire town. The crowd that gathered was silent, watching, processing, starting to understand that the most powerful man in 3 counties was going down, and that the strange mail-order bride they'd all judged had been right all along. After Thornton was led away in chains, people started approaching Margaret, slowly at first, then in a steady stream. "Mrs. Brennan, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. Thank you for standing up when the rest of us were too scared. You saved my ranch, my family, everything." Margaret accepted each apology with grace. She didn't gloat, didn't remind them how badly they treated her, just nodded and said, "I did what was right," nothing more. But inside she felt vindication, not just for herself, for her father, for Pete, for everyone who'd been hurt by Thornton's greed. 3 days after the arrest, Will and a group of ranchers rode back into the mountains. They brought Pete's body home on a wagon draped in his own bedroll, traveling slowly over the rough roads with the respect due a fallen hero. The whole town turned out for the funeral. Even those who judged Margaret harshly came to pay respects. Old Pete had been known and respected. His death fighting for justice had transformed him into something more than a ranch hand. He'd become a symbol. Reverend Matthews spoke about sacrifice and honor, about standing up for what's right even when it costs everything, about friendship that transcends circumstance. Margaret stood with Will and the children dry-eyed but hollow. When it came time for others to speak, she stepped forward. The crowd quieted. "Pete saved my life," she said simply. "He didn't have to. We barely knew each other. But he believed in justice, believed in doing what was right, and he gave everything for that belief." Her voice cracked. "I'll never forget him." "None of us should." Ethan stepped up beside her. "Mr. Pete taught me to rope cattle last summer. He was patient, kind. He told me stories about fighting with Pa in the war. He said the bravest thing a man can do is protect those who can't protect themselves." The boy's voice was steady. "That's what he did. He protected Miss Maggie. And because of that, we still have her. So we should thank him. Not just remember him." "Thank him," the crowd murmured agreement. Will put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, pride evident in his face. They buried Pete on a hill overlooking the Brennan Ranch, where he could see the land he'd helped protect. Margaret planted wildflowers on his grave, yellow primrose and purple lupine seeds she'd gathered from the meadow below. A promise renewed every spring. As the mourners dispersed, Will pulled Margaret aside. He would have liked that, Will said quietly, being remembered that way. He deserved it. Margaret looked at the fresh-turned earth. He deserved so much more than he got. "We'll make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Will's voice was firm. "The trial's in 2 weeks. We'll see Thornton convicted. We'll see justice done." Margaret nodded. "For Pete, for my father, for everyone Thornton hurt." The trial was held in Cheyenne 2 weeks later. Margaret testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through her father's documents, explaining the fraud in detail, recounting the ambush that killed Pete. Silas Thornton's lawyers tried to discredit her, called her a liar, a criminal, a woman scorned, seeking revenge for imagined wrongs. But the evidence was overwhelming. Document after document, testimony after testimony. A pattern of theft so clear even Thornton's expensive lawyers couldn't explain it away. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Thornton was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. His assets were seized to compensate the victims of his fraud. Beatrice Thornton left Wyoming Territory the day after the verdict, returning east in disgrace. Margaret stood outside the courthouse after it was over, breathing in the cold Cheyenne air, feeling lighter than she had in months. "It's done," Will said beside her. "It's done," Margaret agreed. "Your father would be proud. So would Pete." They rode back to Milford Creek together, taking their time talking about the future, about the ranch, about the children, about the life they were building from the ruins of their separate pasts. When they arrived home, the children rushed out to greet them. Even Rose, now 6 months old, babbling and reaching for Margaret with chubby hands. That evening, after the children were in bed, Will led Margaret to the porch. They sat together watching the stars, and Will pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we're already married," he said, "but I want to do this right." He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a small stone. "This was my grandmother's. She gave it to my mother. My mother gave it to me when I married Catherine." Will's voice was steady. "Catherine wore it for 7 years. Now I want you to have it." "Well, I can't take Catherine's ring. It's not Catherine's ring anymore. It's my family's ring, and you're my family now." Will took Margaret's hand. "When I married you, it was an arrangement. But somewhere along the way, it became real. You became real. My feelings became real. And I want you to have this ring as a symbol of that. As proof that you're not just my wife on paper. You're my wife in my heart." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. She'd spent her whole life being practical, keeping emotions locked away, protecting herself from being hurt. But with Will, she didn't have to protect herself. She could just feel. Yes, she said. Yes, I want the ring. Yes, I want to be your wife in every way. Yes to all of it. Will slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. They kissed under the stars, and it felt like a new beginning. Not forgetting the past, not erasing Catherine or Margaret's father or Pete or any of the people they'd lost, but building something new while honoring what came before. A year later, Margaret gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas William Brennan after her father and her husband. A bridge between past and present, between grief and hope. The ranch prospered. The children thrived. Ethan grew tall and serious, taking on more responsibility. Sarah learned to read fluently and taught her siblings. Lily became the family storyteller. Michael lost his babyish roundness and turned into a sturdy little boy. Rose took her first steps, then her first words growing from the sick infant Margaret had saved into a healthy, happy child. And Margaret found something she'd never expected to find. A home. A real home. Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. A family that was hers by choice rather than blood. A purpose that extended beyond mere survival. She was appointed Deputy Land Surveyor for Wyoming Territory, the first woman to hold the position. She used her father's methods to prevent future fraud, to protect homesteaders, to ensure that what happened under Thornton's regime never happened again. People who'd once shunned her now sought her advice. Women who'd called her names now asked her to teach their daughters to read. Men who'd wanted her gone now tipped their hats in respect. But the best moments were the quiet ones. Sitting on the porch with Will after the children were asleep, teaching Thomas's letters, watching Rose toddle after chickens, reading by firelight while Will mended tack and the children played. One evening, 2 years after she'd first arrived, Margaret stood at the window watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Will came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. Happy, he asked. More than I ever thought possible. Any regrets? Margaret thought about it. About leaving Boston, about answering an advertisement from a stranger, about walking through a blizzard, about everything that had brought her here. Not once, she said, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. And it was. Despite the violence and loss and struggle, despite the grief and pain and fear, she'd found her place, her purpose, her family. She'd found home. On a spring afternoon, 3 years after Margaret's arrival, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. The handwriting was shaky, but elegant. Margaret opened it with curiosity. Dear Mrs. Brennan, I write not seeking forgiveness, for I don't deserve it. But I owe you truth. My husband manipulated me as he manipulated everyone. I thought I was protecting our position in society. Instead, I became complicit in his crimes. You were braver than I ever was. You stood for truth when I chose comfortable lies. I've lost everything. My home, my position, my husband. But I've gained something I didn't have before: clarity. I see now what I couldn't see then. That dignity isn't about what others think of you. It's about what you know of yourself. You were right about everything, and I was wrong. I hope someday to possess even a fraction of your courage. With respect, Beatrice Thornton. Margaret read the letter twice. Then she sat at her desk and wrote back. Brief, honest, Mrs. Thornton, thank you for your letter. Courage isn't about never being wrong. It's about having the strength to admit when you are. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. You've taken the first step toward redemption. That's worth something. I wish you peace in whatever comes next. Margaret Brennan. She never heard from Beatrice again, but sometimes late at night, Margaret thought about the woman who'd been her enemy and felt something close to compassion. Beatrice Thornton had lost everything to protect a lie. Margaret had risked everything to protect the truth. In the end, that made all the difference. Years later, when her grandchildren asked her to tell the story of how she came to Wyoming, Margaret would always start the same way. December 17th, 1885. I stepped off a train with $23 and no idea what I was walking into, and she'd end the same way too. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from what's comfortable toward what's unknown, because that's where life is, in the unknown, in the risk, in the willingness to trust that you're strong enough to handle whatever comes. I walked through a blizzard to reach Wyoming, and I found more than a husband or a home. I found myself. I found my strength. I found my family, and I found the truth every person should know. You are stronger than you believe, braver than you imagine, and worthy of every good thing that comes your way. Don't let anyone tell you different. The children would listen with wide eyes and Margaret would smile, remembering the girl who'd stepped off that train so long ago. So scared, so alone, so certain she was making a terrible mistake. She'd been wrong about the mistake, but right about the courage it took. And that made all the difference. The end.